So here's the wake-up call, oh church, is I was just reading an article this morning saying that in 2019, 50% of the babies born in the United States were born to single parents. So if the family historically has been the foundation of where your discipleship happens, and you no longer have a family structure that disciples, all of the sudden, the local church had better get its act together and figuring out what does discipleship actually look like, because there's a tsunami that's about to hit us in a few years if we're not already in the middle of it.
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
So we want to talk about evangelism today. Always a dicey subject.
Everybody's just thrilled, I know it.
Right, people stiffen in their seats. Evangelism. I think, well, maybe we start with that swirling atmosphere of guilt. Because that's an odd response, isn't it? Because on the one hand, it's odd. Well, it's odd because in, theologically conservative Christian circles and certainly in evangelical circles in America, evangelism has been in the past extolled, right? We celebrate evangelism, and you want to be known as somebody. If you're an organization, by the way, if a Christian organization, you want to be known for being evangelistic. If you're a church, some of the buzzwords are often outreach, evangelism. And yet, there's this common feeling that we're really not doing enough of it in our day-to-day lives. And if you talk about it to a group of people, they often will say something along those lines. Well, gosh, I have these people in my life who are they're falling apart. I know I should say more, but I don't want to. It's embarrassing. It's awkward. It's weird. So yes, there's a kind of conflicted feeling. But then, of course, let's be nerds and bring in data, because that's what we do. But Barna and
ruin it with some numbers for us.
Yeah, ruin it with numbers. But in Pew Research, these remain very helpful resources. By the way, if you're interested in religious trends, check them out. But numbers are in, and evangelism is not very popular right now among young people. Now we can nuance this a bit and talk about, dig into what we really mean by evangelism.
I think they must have only polled young people on this, because why are we picking on the young people here?
Yes.
This seems to be something that everybody dislikes.
Everybody dislikes it. I think I would venture to say, Nathan, that a lot of people, you wouldn't put it in these terms, but see evangelism as a kind of necessary evil. Then it sounds almost sacrilegious to say that, but just meaning, it's like eating my broccoli. I know it's good for me. It's something I ought to do, but I don't want to. But I guess I really should be doing it, and I should be doing more of it. But
okay, hang on a second.
So a couple. Well, yeah.
But let's bring this in.
Am I being too negative?
No. Well, let's broaden it out here and look at that a second, because I remember reading a book by Guy Kawasaki, who was the head evangelist for Apple. Yeah, you heard that right. Apple phones, Apple computers, the whole shebang. For a technology company, that was his actual working title, was evangelist. So there's a way in which the word has been co-opted into something, but here was somebody who had a product that he was really, really excited about, and it was his job to make that product as well known and to extol its virtues and disseminate that information as far as possible, by any means necessary, seemingly. Okay, so that would be evangelistic fervor. Or you hear people talk excitedly about sports teams that they follow, or coffee shops they like, or diets people are not adverse to talking about things and spreading ideas. However, when you get into evangelism, you're no longer talking about a commodity or just an idea. So it's not like, hey, I think this is the best phone. There's something very, very different and if you could help us put our finger on what that difference is, I think that would help us say why I'm not ashamed to talk about any other thing that's important in my life, except for the awkwardness of the thing that seems to be the most important in my life.
Well, a couple of items to note there. Yeah. You're making me think of C.S. Lewis's aside in his meditation on the reflection on the Psalms. by broad consensus, not one of his best books, but this little section is great when he talks about praise, how that just comes naturally to all of us human beings. And you just mentioned it, Nathan. You have a coffee that you really like. You just want to shout it from the rooftops. You experience something great. You want to tell other people about it. That's just kind of the way we are. It's different here, though. So yeah, you're a product evangelist. The stakes aren't that high. I mean, they are in the sense that, yes, you're on the line for something being sold and all of that. And, there are stakeholders, all of that. Okay, let's put that aside. It's not that big of a deal because if this is a really sensational product that will make people's lives easier, enhance convenience and give them some kind of joy, it's not too difficult to be an evangelist for that kind of thing. But if we're talking about Jesus Christ, you're talking about not a product, but a person, and not just any person, the way, the truth, and the life, who, if Christianity is true, has a definitive claim on your life. And if you come face to face with him, you have to deal with that claim. And you have to, you either, it's an acceptance or a refusal. And this is spelled out in terms of commitment. Another thing that we don't like in the Western world.
Yeah. And so beyond the product thing there too, though, is that, like, okay, I'm going to say something that seems sacrilegious to a lot of you listening, but let's imagine that your favorite football team is actually just a preference. Like when you're talking about sports teams, we're talking about football, which Cameron doesn't watch, and coffee, which I don't drink. So we're using analogies that don't apply to our lives. But again, there's a way to be hyped about.
I do listen
something.
to Taylor Swift though, so that makes me a default NFL fan. Just kidding.
Cameron now cheers for the Chiefs. All right, great.
I'm just kidding.
Tune in next year to find out what Yeah, so anyway, product preference, we get it. Like there isn't that much on the line there, and we expect people to jovially push back and not take us too seriously when we claim that something is the greatest if it's a consumer product or something that everybody assumes is a preference. So in that sense, okay, that makes sense. There's a big difference in what's at stake.
But another problem, we tend to evaluate stuff that we buy in terms of, it makes perfect sense, convenience. Well, and I'm going to come back to what we're using sales language here, and we're doing so on purpose. I think part of the stigma surrounding evangelism as we see it and know it today has to do with the fact that it feels a bit like a sales pitch. The way it's structured, the way the appeal is made, not always, but often it is. So that's why we'll come back to that, but I'm just telling you that this is intentional use of this language. I'm not sliding into this. But if you're thinking in terms of convenience, now, that's often the way. In the past, evangelism, I would say, Nathan, and feel free to push back on this, but I actually don't think you will. I would say we put a lot of time and energy, we being Christians in North America, put a lot of time and energy into thinking about how to make appeals persuasive, but also appealing, really attractive. And when you look at the evangelistic strategy of Jesus Christ, I've said this before, he's just a really bad PR person for himself. He starts off really well with that first miracle, turning water into wine. I mean, if there's anything that'll get you a following, hey, there it is right there. Feeding the 5,000. I mean, this is just a guaranteed way. It's better than any TED Talk. But then he goes on to say things like, anyone who does not hate father or mother, and then just to make sure that you really got the point, brother or sister, stepfather or stepmother, any family member, is not worthy to follow me. Take up your cross. So
the world hates me, they'll hate you too.
The world hates me, they'll hate you too. So I mean, taking up one's cross. I mean, that's the picture of that that our Lord has given to us of following him. Now, we can spring ahead for a second here. I do happen to believe, of course, that if you follow Christ, your life will be unbelievably enhanced. It'll be better than you could ever imagine. But That doesn't preclude hardship, that doesn't preclude learning, and doesn't change the fact that right now you do live in a fallen world. You won't be alone. I love the way Dallas Willard used to say, we talk a lot about the cost of discipleship, as we should, but we also should talk about the cost of non-discipleship. Because if you're not following Jesus and learning to be like him, that means you have to go through this extremely difficult, hard world alone. You have to do that on your own versus doing it.
Yeah, okay. So that's
with
good.
the empowerment
That's a
of
good
the Spirit.
segue. You just slipped in another word, which is the direction here, because Willard said that about discipleship, not about evangelism. So you just switched from evangelism to discipleship, which does seem to be Jesus's preferred term. And even, if you're thinking to the Great Commission, Jesus does not separate evangelism and discipleship out. They're all one and the same. And it seems to me that perhaps, I'm trying to think, why do we tend toward language around evangelism more than discipleship? Perhaps because evangelism is a lighter suitcase. Like, it's just a set of ideas, which also might mean why we kind of like, this doesn't really feel right. Sure. In the sense that, because Willard and Jesus, let's put that the other way, Jesus and Willard and whoever else comments on discipleship are saying, we're talking about a full body integrated commitment to something that'll change the way that you marry, bury, eat, sleep, treat other people, treat your enemy, treat the people you like, treat your neighbors, perhaps how you care about the earth and every other. Nothing in your life is untouched and unfazed by what it is that Jesus is calling us to. So that's a pretty big load to share with somebody in a short amount of time. That being said, it does work and it does happen, and there are good biblical accounts of everything from Paul and the jailer to where there isn't a pre-existing relationship. All of us know people who have come to faith through somebody just sitting down and sharing their faith with them. Here's why I think that's a little bit different in our time, particularly in the West, is that evangelism works really, really well. First of all, as a starting point, not as a destination. So if you have an hour beside somebody on a flight, you're planting a seed at best. You're not harvesting timber there. That's the beginning of what God wants for them. He doesn't want an intellectual assent to his existence. He wants a full-bodied commitment from them in the long run. So we're not poo-pooing that idea as that's not really valuable. But that seemed to work best in a culture and an atmosphere where people were also thinking spiritually. And then you just had to say, hey, but if you align your spiritual thoughts in this way, there you go. And so this is a whole new category. Even when you look at Paul, a lot of the time that he spent, he was arguing from the scriptures that Jesus was the Christ, right? So there was a shared set of values and a shared language that he had even with the people that he was, quote, doing evangelism to, where he was trying to get them to align a mutual set of goals and ideals in the right direction. We no longer have that, like when I was doing a lot of campus ministry in New England, no longer was there not a awareness of a spiritual reality. There was zero respect for scripture or for truth. So evangelism had to start pretty far back if you didn't agree on truth and scripture or the fact that there was actually a spiritual world. It's now there are still lots of people that you can sit down with, and the Lord's been working in their lives, and the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few. But that being said, most of the times in which we approach this out of a sense of guilt and improper motivation, and out of a sense of that this is going to be like a product transaction, it's going to go nowhere fast, and it'll feel awkward, probably because it is. How's that for a rosy picture?
So my intuition, that's a rosy picture, all right. Well, my intuition here, Nathan, is, and this is based not merely on my, personal feelings, but also some of the conversations I've had with younger people. And I know you can chime in here as well, Nathan, because you've spent a lot of time recently on campuses talking to students. But my feel is not that they're opposed to evangelism full stop, but that this kind of one-off transactional approach is on its way out. Because it's, I think a lot of younger people, and I think a lot of people, period, now. Why stop with younger people? People, period, are tired of being manipulated and twisted and bent in a certain direction. I mean, in a sense, we are just bursting at the seams with really phenomenal communicators. I mean, and today We have product evangelists left, right, and center. Most influencers are really great product evangelists. That's how they make their money. So you've got people selling you stuff all the time. So the old strategies of evangelism that make it kind of more that are kind of built around a sales pitch, so to speak, I think are ringing hollow in people's ears. But also,
it's highly contested space.
It's highly contested space. You got some.
Everybody's trying to sell a life-changing something.
They are. And okay, I'm going to take us in a weird direction here for a second. Totally unplanned, but this is thinking out loud. But also, Nathan, here's what's interesting. Everybody's trying to sell you stuff that you like, and a lot of people have built their careers on finding creative ways to tickle people's ears. I want to be really careful here, okay? Because I know let me just state for the record that I want to say this. I want to extend good faith to all of the many wonderful outreach efforts out there. We've
been part of
strategies.
We're not
we've been part
here.
of them. Absolutely. Exactly. So
probably
the
will be in
intentions
the
behind so much of this probably will. So the intentions behind so much of this stuff are good intentions. But I think evangelicals and a lot of theologically conservative Christians in North America were natural-born activists. This is not my thought. This belongs to Mark Knoll. It's really good. This was an off-the-cuff remark he made in an interview. I've referenced it multiple times because I think it's very wise and very shrewd. But he says, oh yeah, so since I wrote my book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, not I, but Mark Knoll, he said there has been a groundswell of scholarly activity among evangelicals. And I mean, there are. We have brilliant scholars. We've got brilliant intellectual journals. There's the Evangelical Theological Society, the Evangelical Philosophical Society. So we got no shortage of nerds in our camp. But he pointed out that by and large, we tend to be activists first, which is a strength and a weakness. It's a strength because we're really great at mobilizing people. We're really great at causes. We're really great at relief efforts. We're weak in the sense that we're not as reflective about it. We don't pause to think about long-term implications. So say Billy Graham crusades. We don't think about long-term implications of, giving this a very emotionally charged, very powerful pitch to thousands and thousands of people, and then thinking about what the long-term results will be in terms of, how are these people being followed up with? What does discipleship look like? All of that. That's where we tend to, we have a lot of conferences where we want to rush people to decisions without thinking through, but what are the follow-up strategies? Are we really inviting them into a whole way of life, as you said, Nathan, an integrated way of life? So I just wanted to say that, just state that for the record. I think that the intentions are good here. And if, Billy Graham was pretty clear in many of his subsequent interviews that when people who came forward at his rallies, he would say some of them, who knows where they are now. He'd say others, there were tons of people behind the scenes who had been pouring into them for years, and then I just happened to be the person who the Lord used at that final moment. That's a very good way to look at it, very spiritually mature. But Nathan, here's another interesting thing. There's another kind of influencer out there. And this kind of influencer is the opposite of the happy, clappy, everything's great, I'm going to tell you exactly what you want to hear. But this kind of influencer says, hey, you need to make your bed. All right, I won't do any more silly impressions. But they will tell you to make your bed. They will tell you to get up. They will tell you they will work you till you throw up, whether these guys are workout guys, or I'm thinking of people like David Goggins. I'm thinking of people like Jordan Peterson. And what they're doing is really fascinating to me because it's especially some of the really harsh fitness influencer guys, it's discipleship adjacent in the sense that they are recommending disciplines as a means to an end to make you a certain kind of person with more stability and steadiness. Now, they don't go far enough. It's not, I'm not saying that they're Christian, but yeah.
Well, let me jump in here because, all right, now you stepped on it.
Please do.
So a couple weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks maybe, the Wall Street Journal had a Sunday piece on what the church can learn from, I think it said Jordan Peterson. There's a list of people there. And he said, the author of this article said, what Jordan Peterson is doing, and a host of others, is they're encouraging young men to be better people for their own sake. So he said that
Right.
if you look at what these guys are saying, they're saying be a better person because it's good for you, whereas the church usually says serve the world, take care of others. And so young men are going to say, well, what's in it for me?
Yep.
And these other gurus are going to say, here's what's in it for you. So there's a sense in which they're saying the church is failing to show people why church is good for them, not just makes them the kind of person that's good for other people. Now, I would have a fairly different anthropology there of saying that you don't feel like you're fully human or that you're deeply connected to a community until you're actually serving in that capacity. And we would see modeled in the life of who Jesus is himself, that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, some pretty high indication that the fullness of what it means to be a satisfied human does pertain exactly to your relationship and the way in which you extend serving power to other people. So theology aside, let's just point that out as the distinction there between a quote guru who says, look, this is going to make you faster, stronger, more appealing to women, whatever, and this is good for you, versus Jesus who says, if you follow me, you'll probably die a miserable death and it'll be good for God's glory and for your neighbor's good. So that's a distinction there.
So huge.
That we just want to recognize as real.
Yeah, huge. Well, and not only that, I mean, you also brought in the other fact that most of those guys I mentioned they're targeted at men. Their main audiences are men who are suffering from various levels of complacency. So, I mean, the key targets there, though, are laziness and addiction to comfort. Most of these guys go after that really, really hard. Now, it's true. The way that they will get this across is, you owe this to yourself to become, I don't know how many times you've heard this phrase, Nathan, but I hear it more and more, becoming the best version of yourself. Have you heard? I'm hearing that
Well, I mean, you have the
now.
army, be all you can be. I mean, that's been around for a long time.
Be all you can be. That's been around for a long time. But the best version of myself, I'm hearing that more and more. Yeah, so they don't go far enough, obviously. They're not going in the direction of self-sacrifice and devotion to God and neighbor. But they're taking us a step beyond the addiction to comfort, which I think is helpful. That's where I think I see this as a little bit discipleship adjacent, in the sense that you have these disciplines that are there to bring you to a place where you have control. You basically have higher degree of self-control, and you're not. But their message is not pitched in terms of wish fulfillment.
Yeah, but
at least not immediately. So
clarify here, though, because practicing self-control is a
sure.
vastly repeated theme in the New Testament, particularly in the writing of Paul. So, we're not saying anything
against. Basically, a fruit. It's a fruit of the Spirit. Yeah.
Yeah. So the difference here is there's a difference between being the best version of me that I can be and the most Christ-like version of me that I can be. Those are two wildly different standards at play here. So,
and there's a certain notion of self-control that puts all the emphasis on control. So it's almost you have to have bolded control on that. Where the notion is that you throw comfort out the window, but to gain total and entire mastery of your body, and then by extension your life. A Christian would recognize that self-control is, you work on it, it is cultivated as a fruit of the Spirit, but you're not in full control of your life because your life is not your own, and you control almost nothing in your daily circumstances.
Here's another difference, though, is that the types of self-control or misery that we put ourselves through, say, by some fad under the guise of some guru, is in order to sculpt ourselves into some image that other people appreciate. So if I work really hard, I can look great at the gym. If I work really hard, I can win this race. If I do this, I can run this Tough Mudder. If I do this, I can mountain bike in this way. Like, society appreciates those things, where oftentimes the things that are really hard that Jesus calls us to are not going to make you get your own documentary or TV miniseries based on. So the way in which these kind of the economy of the economy of respect that goes along with what you end up being is very different.
And so I think we can conclude from this little aside that essentially all those guys I brought in are just the other side of the coin, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
I do think they have some valuable insights to offer. I'm not throwing that out, but it's still a version of an appealing message that is there in the end to enhance your own personal life, rather than the message of Christ, which is a call to a life of self-sacrifice for God first and for neighbor. So
yeah,
it's not taking up your cross.
Yeah, but it's also clear and encouraging that Jesus thinks that you are way more capable of stuff than you think you are. So there is a higher calling because he knows what's possible for your life. And there's something comforting in the fact that if he created you, he knows what you're capable of. So there is that. That's a real thing. Like, that's a real drive and something we really should seek and crave and be excited about. So don't hear us poo-pooing that idea.
Well, and I think that also this is why people work with coaches. And essentially coaches and some of these guys who are very motivational, who are good at what they do, like a David Goggins, whose stuff I appreciate. You just have to get used to his language if you're not. But these guys push people into, we're all capable of much more than we realize. And of course, the one who ultimately knows that deeply is our Maker. And if you look at the scriptural, picture of personhood, you can see that the bar is set very high because we're made in God's image. But these guys, part of where they're honing in on some central truth is they're showing you, no, even you, a person like you, can do this. You really can. It's a matter of changing your mindset. Yeah.
All right. Here's the problem.
There's some stuff there.
All right. A little bad news here. This is me speculating, and then you tell me if you think this is true. Here's the problem, is that the reason that the church is so bad at discipleship right now is because historically discipleship has not happened in the church. It's happened in the family. You're actually discipled by your parents, and that's where you learn the ins and outs. Now, there are people who grew up in non-Christian homes and came into the church in the past, but by and large, if you want the formative ideas of how do you pray, how do you treat other people, how do you spend your money, how do you think about X, Y, Z, what does the behind the scenes look like of a mature spiritual life, you get that from your parents. Historically, that's where it happens. And so just here in the last, 10 years, for my local church, we're all of a sudden having to ask the question, well, what does it mean to baptize a high school student who has no Christian extended family? What are you going to do about that? And then you look, so here's the wake-up call, church, is I was just reading an article this morning saying that in 2019, 50% of the babies born in the United States were born to single parents. So if the family historically has been the foundation of where your discipleship happens, and you no longer have a family structure that disciples, all of the sudden, the local church had better get its act together and figuring out what does discipleship actually look like, because there's a tsunami that's about to hit us in a few years, if we're not already in the middle of it, of saying we no longer have the intimate relational structures that were our historical ways of discipling people. They're no longer in place, and so we have to construct new ones.
I think I would put the emphasis on the word intimate there as well. One of Dallas Willard's big concerns when he talked about discipleship and our strategies surrounding it was that it would get too formalized. And I think the older I get, the more I'm sensitive to that. I think we're going to have to think creatively, and we're going to have to think organizationally as churches about discipleship. But we also want to foster an environment where you've got older people in your church. So here's another thing. You're going to need good diversity, age diversity in your churches. You're going to need some people who are further along the road, who have that experience, who can essentially serve as spiritual parents. And they have to be available. So for those of you who are older and have real wisdom, I know we live in a culture, this is very countercultural. We live in a culture that fetishizes youth and only wants to hear from the young people, only wants to create programs targeting them, only wants to hear their insights. But those of you who are older, your insights are going to be absolutely vital. But we also need your willingness to pour into younger people, to be available to them. And so in informal ways, to let them come over to your house, to be able to have coffee with them whenever, or and just basically be available to them to meet. And, there can be some structures to this. You could, have scenarios where you meet with this person X amount of times a month or something like that, but also just a sort of open door policy where you have that, where these people have access to you and to that spiritual wisdom, which they desperately need. Yeah, and they don't need, the last thing they need, by the way, is somebody who knows all the cultural lingo and is up with all the latest trends and fads. No young person needs that. They don't need that. They need somebody to be a grown-up, a spiritual grown-up. And I think that would be my encouragement along those lines as we think about this as churches, Nathan, as you and I think about that, as we start to get older now. But yeah, that would be my encouragement there.
All right, let me try one last idea on you here. I have a whole lot of ideas on this, but here's something that I'm going to say this out loud and then we'll decide if it's true. I think that most institutions were formed out of a sense of discipleship. So let's think about that for a minute when I say that. So think about that in the sense of an academic institution. You had a group of people who had an ideal for how humans ought to be educated and shaped and formed, and then they said, we're going to put together a sequence and a series of educational and a whole structure devoted around producing a certain type of student for a specific task. Well, bam, there you have a college, institution, university, whatever. Same thing is true for denominations. You have a group of people who are interested in following Jesus in the same way, and birds of a feather flock together, and voila, out of a desire for discipleship, you suddenly now have an institution. If my hypothesis that I'm just making up as we go here is correct, that institutions form out of attempts of discipleship, and we're living in a time in which institutions of all shapes and sizes are collapsing, then it shouldn't surprise us that discipleship is in a free fall of how in the world do we do this well. So, before we move on from there, a penny for your thoughts on my 14-second-old theory.
Yes. Well, I think in large terms, Nathan, I like your theory. I think it's helpful. We definitely are at a cultural moment of massive institutional distrust, but also big disruption. That's a buzzword, and everybody's tired of hearing about disruption, but it's a legitimate word here. It applies. I was reading something recently, and this plays directly into what you were saying, Nathan, about how television and movie theaters are finding themselves struggling. They've been struggling for many years, but they're struggling more and more, and they see more ominous warning signs because of TikTok. Increasingly younger people, that is television for them, scrolling through these short videos and all that. And yeah, we can speculate about what's happening with attention spans and all of that, but the interesting feature here to point out is the cultural gatekeepers of the old institutions don't function quite the same way anymore. It used to be the case in the 1960s all the way through the 90s. This is amazing to me, but this really was true. Journalists could destroy the career of a band. This is just one small point. Because they were the ones covering the band, and people had limited access to music. There were no streaming services or anything like that. These bands depended for their livelihood on airplay on the radio and coverage from journalists. So these people really were gatekeepers in that sense. And if they didn't like something, they could destroy it. Those gatekeeping possibilities are totally obsolete now, because this stuff, most of the people who are superstars on TikTok and all of these, they're not people, A-list actors from Hollywood. These are people who have bought cameras, have enough tech savvy to be able to set up shots, and are making and just writing their scripts. They're not going through tons of committees, nothing like that. They're just making this stuff right here and now, using their creative powers, and people love it. So yes, I think there's massive distrust of institutions, and so now people don't quite know who to look to. And when they are looking to people, these are not the traditionally, quote, vetted celebrities, right? Who have gone through some kind of system, have appeared in a certain film, or have a record contract. These are people who are operating independently, almost kind of guerrilla style. In that kind of environment, that's where. So, is it any wonder then, Nathan, that people are saying, "Oh, we want more authenticity, we want more grittiness, we want more realness"? So it's almost as though there's a sort of
No, but-
anti-celebrity facet to this. Yeah.
Yeah, but I see an opportunity here. And I was telling some denominational leaders, I said, the problem with your denomination is that it's competing against the internet. And so all of the things that institutions used to provide to individuals, the internet now does. And so the institution is largely obsolete. So say it's a Christian, your denomination used to help you find Bible study material, Sunday school material, help you with your missions and where to drill wells in Africa. And you can do all of that now on Amazon in 47 seconds with bypasses. So there's a sense in which some of that has moved aside. However, back to your point, this is why I think I'm optimistic about this, is what did Jesus say to people when he called them? He said, come and see, or more often, come follow me. And so it was an invitation into a way of life that was intimate, walking together, eating together, sleeping in the olive grove together. Just, the nitty gritty of life, where people could see how people behaved in all contexts and situations. I think we are becoming exhausted with our quick and our fast and our highly digital to some degree, and we will begin seeking people who we feel like have lives that we want to emulate once again. And we're working now, and I think prioritizing making time to spend time with the people who we think actually have a life worth living. And that only makes sense if you think that your life can actually change. And the only person who's really promising to do that in a fully integrated and wholesome way is Jesus Christ. So there still is a mandate to share good news, but the depth and the scale of what it will require of those of us who are interested in that endeavor is nothing short of something that will have to be divinely led and then collectively as a church participated in order for this to go well. I think that's why Jesus said, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers. That's why Paul often said, pray for me that the doors would be open, because we recognize that in the missional nature of who God is and where we find our foundation for the mission that we ought to be on, that God is the one who moves first. He softens the heart. He opens the doors. When Peter got to Cornelius, the Lord had done a lot of work in Cornelius already. And so those are the times when it's fun to do evangelism, because you're showing up and participating in what God is already doing. You're not trying to force something or force a conversation for your own glory or for the fact that you can tell people, hey, I do this, you should be impressed with me. So the motivation there, who moves first, why is it that we're doing it, and then recognizing that when you step into a conversation on full life reformation with somebody, that is going to take a very long time, and it'll be something that is done inspired by the Spirit and is only possible by the Spirit of God. That feels more accurate to me. But it also is more joyful when you think of the impossibility of that and then remember that right after Jesus commanded that, he said, hey, I'm with you always, even to the very end of the age. So he doesn't leave us as orphans or, outcast in this project. When we step into what God's already doing, this is good work, but it's certainly fun to take a few minutes to think about the changing nature of that in the moment, in the time, and the culture in which we find ourselves. But the good news is that the gospel is good news in whatever context you find yourself today. So we hope this conversation has been helpful to you in thinking about the kind of the wholesomeness of the call to make disciples from Christ and seeing the appropriate spots in which evangelism fits into that. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, the podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.